Welcome to Digital Hammurabi, your guide to the ancient world, and a podcast devoted to sharing reliable, fact-based scholarship without the jargon of academia. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. I'm passionate about ancient history, and with 2 graduate degrees in the field, I am intimately familiar with the world of academic research. I'm here to help you avoid ancient aliens and, with nearly a decade of podcasting experience, help academic researchers explain their work in an entertaining and engaging way. Hello everybody, welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, and today, my name is Megan Lewis. For those who have not joined us before, I should probably lead with that. Today on Digital Hammurabi, I am joined by Dr. Jessie DeGrado, Assistant Professor of Ancient Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan. Dr. DeGrado studies the history and religions of Mesopotamia and is particularly interested in how modern history and politics affect our reconstruction of the past. He's here today to talk to me about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the role of ancient Judah as a client state of that empire, and how modern understandings of the Middle East colour our views of the region's ancient past. Dr. DeGrado, thank you for joining me today.
Nice to be here.
I always lead with this question because I think it's really interesting for people to know how we get into this somewhat obscure field. So how did you first become interested in the study of the ancient world?
Yeah, it was not a particularly straightforward path for me. My BA was in math. So I did not major in the humanities even. And I often I'll have students take a couple classes with me and say that they feel pressure to get a STEM degree, but their passion is in the humanities. And I'm happy to be able to say, you can get that STEM degree, you can have that sort of job security, and then you can go do what you're really excited about, knowing that you have the option to fall back on something important.
Why not both?
Yeah. So I did always enjoy history, but not in the classroom really. So when I was very young, my dad and I used to hike in a state park that had these crumbling remains of very, very early colonial stone houses and make up stories about them. But when I took history classes in school through most of high school, it was just a sort of endless list of dates. And what I actually found I really liked was historical fiction and this thrill I would have of imagining alternate possibilities in the past. And so when I was in college for some of my distribution requirements, one of the classes I took was on the Bible, sort of the history of the Bible. I think it was just Introduction to Hebrew Bible. And I had grown up vaguely, not particularly devout, but in a family that went to, we were Quaker and Catholic. It was a complicated situation. So
that is a mix.
Go to meetings sometimes. I was aware that there were a lot of differences and disagreements in these sorts of religious traditions. I signed up for a class on the Bible, sort of curious. And the thing that really hooked me was on the first day of class, having the professor come in and say, hey, so at the time that you all know the story of Jericho, she tells us the story of Jericho. At the time the walls were supposed to come tumbling down, there were no walls. And that was really different for me. The difference between sort of having grown up in a tradition where we were told some things in the Bible might not be accurate versus being told, here is this story. We have identified the site. We have located it. We have excavated it. And this is not historically accurate. And I was I was really hooked by that.
Did your interest kind of continue with the biblical history path, or did you diversify later on?
Yeah, so then I did end up, I ended up starting an Akkadian because I was told this is what you have to do if you want to study the Bible. And I fell in love with Akkadian. And just realizing that the Bible is, if you have the New Testament, it's like, if you're watching, it's tiny, tiny, tiny. The Hebrew Bible's bigger, but it still comes to us through this very complex process of transmission. And compared to we probably have over 1 million cuneiform texts. So compared to the textual record of Mesopotamia, and the breadth, the chronological span, the Bible is just teensy. And I actually kind of loved that feeling that it gave me of realizing that my own tradition, which I had thought of as ancient and very, very large, is actually made very small. This sort of feeling of being small, ourselves, our traditions, our families.
That's awesome. I feel similarly. I came to this originally wanting to be a classicist, and then I had an Assyriologist as an undergraduate advisor and was completely blown away by just the sheer amount of material that there is I think it's absolutely wonderful. So you started biblical history, went out into Akkadian because, I mean, it's awesome. What's your current research focus?
Yeah, so I'd say most broadly, almost all of the work I do is about how the study of ancient Mesopotamia is very much entangled with modern imperialism. And by that, I mean both the sort of informal imperialism of the early days of the earliest excavations in Mesopotamia. So we're talking about British and French colonial ambitions in the Middle East, through the British and French mandates in the Middle East, and then all the way into the present and into the legacy of the US invasion of Iraq, and how this modern history actually deeply affects the way we reconstruct the past. So an example of this that's sort of very basic and physical is something I'm looking at in my book that's forthcoming with University Press of Colorado, which is called Assyria's Plunder, From Ancient Empire to Modern Loot. That's really thinking about what does it mean to study in ancient empire when almost every artifact that testifies to this past is now held in a European or an American collection and was taken under imperial domination.
I had an author and journalist on a few months now ago to talk about a book called The Mesopotamian Riddle, which is his research into and recounting of the decipherment of cuneiform. And it's a great book for people who are interested in that process, but it's very much white European dudes going and doing white European things in Iraq and Turkey and places like that.
Since you've discussed that book, can I actually plug another book? There's another book,
please.
Empire, I believe it's Empires of the Plains, that was produced 20 years earlier, but I think is more comprehensive than this more recent book. And I definitely encourage readers, if they read the more recent book that you sort of interviewed the author for, that they dig deeper and really do some more reading about that period, just because there are a couple inaccuracies in that book, I'd say. And specifically about that colonial moment. So I believe that Christian Rassam, who is a Chaldean Christian, is called an Arab in the book. There's so definitely there's a huge wealth of scholarship on this, and I definitely encourage people to read that book and then read more.
Thank you for sharing that. So I said in my introduction that we were going to be talking about, among other things, the client state of Judah. So what is, for those who don't know, what is a client state?
Yeah, so I think people tend to imagine Assyria as this sort of top-down empire that has complete control everywhere it goes. And it's actually the exact opposite of that. Assyria is an incredibly flexible empire, and it's a lot like America. There's actually a very fun piece. Now I'm forgetting, I believe it's Reinhard Bernbeck. I can send it to you if you're interested, that compares America to Assyria. So Assyria prefers to exert control in the least direct way possible. That requires the least resources and tends to engender the least resistance. So when we're thinking about Assyrian control, we can think about a whole spectrum from direct provincialization, which is where you go in and directly incorporate a territory, you depose the king, you put a provincial governor in control, and that's the most expensive and least preferable way, at least in the early Neo-Assyrian period, to administer a territory. There are various other very, very flexible arrangements that Assyria really enjoys, where you essentially show up and demand protection money, taxes, right? And that's it. So you leave a local client to run their own business. For that client, king, say, you pay your taxes to Assyria every year, and beyond that, you are king. You do whatever you want at home. You run your country however you want it. Assyria might have a couple of different motivations in acquiring client rulers. So they may want access to trade routes where they can tax goods traveling on those routes. If there's a rebellion in their empire and they can't access certain roads, they may want to develop an alternate route. They may want a buffer between themselves and another state that is fairly strong. So this happens in the north with Urartu. And actually, Judah is kind of in the boonies. It is this border region between Assyria and Egypt that comes into the imperial orbit fairly late.
So would Judah be considered one of these kind of buffer territories in between the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the Egyptians?
Yes, so I think it's definitely a buffer region. It also provides an alternate trade route. So almost all of I think actually all of the Arabian trade running from South Arabia into the Neo-Assyrian Empire is going through the southern Levant. There are no direct trade routes via Babylonia or via the Middle Euphrates in this period. So far as we're aware, there's a nice 2003 piece by Ryan Byrne on this. And Andrew Danielson has also worked on this. There's a nice article. But so far as we're aware, everything is coming through the southern Levant. The traditional route would be to go through what's now Jordan, north to Damascus, and then to come inland to Assyria, or to ship via Tyre. But in the 730s, when Judah first appears as an Assyrian client, those areas further north have gone into rebellion. And Assyria suddenly becomes very interested in Edom and the Transjordan, in Judah, in the southern Negev, and in Gaza, because that gets them a path to the Mediterranean Sea for Arabian goods. They can then ship them up the coast and get them back into Assyria.
I want to return quickly to something you said a little earlier, that we've had this assumption that the Neo-Assyrian Empire was very much a top-down, very controlling system of rule. Is that because the earliest accounts of it are the Hebrew Bible, and that's kind of how it can be read? Or do you think that is more to do with the modern political atmosphere when we were learning about the Neo-Assyrian Empire as a historical entity?
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely within the Hebrew Bible negative characterizations of Assyria. You can look at Nahum, the prophetic work, but I think that the modern political context also influences how we read a lot of the biblical stories, and that there are biblical stories that are not negative about Assyria that we have sort of retold in our minds so that they become negative. And that has a lot to do, yes, with the context in which the sort of first excavations were happening of Assyria, and then the subsequent political history, where Assyria becomes this sort of paradigmatic evil empire. And we just kind of keep reimagining it in analogy to all sorts of political experiences.
How then, scratch that, different question. Could you give us an example of one of the stories where, in the Hebrew Bible, where the Neo-Assyrian Empire is portrayed in a more favorable light that has kind of been reinterpreted to suit our modern understanding?
So I have a chapter in my book that offers a new reading of the prose portion of Isaiah 7, which is this very famous story because it has in it the prophecy of a child born named Emmanuel. In the context this is written in, this is a text that references some fairly obscure kings from the 8th century BCE. So this is absolutely not a prophecy about Jesus, although it is very familiar to Christian audiences because his name Emmanuel is then picked up in Christian history. And it's instead a story about King Ahaz of Judah, who is terrified because he is facing, according to the biblical story, an attack by King Ritzin of Syria and King Pekah of Israel. And within this story, as it's told, actually Assyria is not present in the Bible version until the very end in what looks like sort of a parenthetical explanation. But the story runs that Ahaz is terrified of these two kings who are trying to depose him, and he goes to the prophet, or the prophet Isaiah comes to him, and this character of the prophet says, basically, why are you being such a wuss? Stand up, be a man, don't be afraid of these guys. In the interpretive tradition, this was eventually tied to Ahaz's submission to Assyria. And that's not totally wrong. This is a story we found out many hundreds of years later, I guess, that Israel, Damascus in this period were in rebellion against Assyria. And there's a very well-established precedent where when a couple client states want to rebel against Assyria, you need as many people as possible to join your anti-Assyrian coalition, because each client state alone is small, but when they're working together, they have a much better chance of succeeding. And so from this context, it becomes clear that Judah is probably being pressured to rebel against Assyria, to join this anti-Assyrian coalition. Scholars still, they read this, and the assumption has always been it's impossible that the prophet Isaiah could be saying, continue to submit to Assyria. He must mean become politically neutral, stay aloof from entanglement. And this is kind of a very anachronistic reading and a funny one if you imagine, because Assyria acquires new clients by showing up and saying, you're my client. You pay me taxes. If you pay taxes, you submit. If you don't pay taxes, you rebel. This is not a scenario where Judah can sit back and say, aha, I'm neutral. And by the time this text is written, Judah has probably already been a client of Assyria. So when we actually go back and read this text, this is Isaiah 7, 1-17, when you have a character like a prophet Isaiah saying to a king, don't be a wuss and don't change what you're doing. Just stay with the status quo. That means don't join the Assyrian rebellion, anti-Assyrian rebellion. Don't cave to pressure to join that rebellion. Keep paying your taxes to Assyria. Continue the status quo. And so that would be an example of a biblical story that once it became unthinkable to audiences that there could be biblical texts that are pro-Assyrian or advocate continued submission. I wouldn't even say this is pro-Assyrian because it's not really interested in Assyria at all. If we recall that the author doesn't really mention Assyria, this is a text that's about showing Judah's regional power, sort of bolstering Judah's regional power against Israel and Damascus, which are more wealthy. And the one place then that Assyria does show up is in prophecies of destruction against Israel and against Damascus. So it's sort of reimagining Assyria as a divine weapon for very regional purposes.
So apart from not being destroyed by the Neo-Assyrian army, what would a client state like Judah have to gain from remaining a client state and not rebelling? Was it advantageous to them, or was it purely like a fear-based decision?
I think it's absolutely advantageous to some people in Judah and probably to the royal family, at least initially. So I tend to mostly speak only about Judah, not Israel. You'll sometimes have people on here talking, like I think talking about ancient Israel, ancient Israelite. Almost every text that we receive in the Bible is edited in Judah. And so I really tend to focus on Judah. When we look archaeologically, Israel, we're looking at sort of more the region around Samaria was much wealthier than Judah. And Damascus was as well. And so it's likely that both Judah and then some of the tribal groups that become Edom in the southern Transjordan, which was not a very settled region, these are groups that were more marginal until you have groups that start, the wealthier parties begin to resist Assyria. They have more to lose. And we have then these weaker states, weaker parties who stand to gain in the local pecking order by submitting to Assyria, because suddenly then attacking Judah is attacking Assyria itself.
Which, if Judah is also being used as an alternative trade route for the Neo-Assyrian Empire, would that have also improved the local economy, or would all of that wealth have just been funneled straight to Assyria?
That we don't have direct evidence for. We do have direct evidence that after Samaria is provincialized, so Israel becomes a client state of Assyria, and it just keeps rebelling. And like I said, Assyria generally prefers not to incorporate places as clients because it's a huge amount of work. You have to actually go take the place fully over, depose the rulers, often transfer populations. They do that in 720 to Samaria after Israel has rebelled at least 3 times in 15 years. And at that point, we suddenly see an explosion of the olive oil trade further south in Judah and in some of the neighboring sort of smaller Ekron Philistine sort of city-states. So a lot of the production that had been happening in Samaria ends up moving further south. So there's definitely economic opportunities that Judah does seize on, for sure.
So moving forward a little bit to more modern history and our understanding and interpretation of these texts in the Bible, can we pinpoint when this almost wholesale reading of the Neo-Assyrian Empire as the big bad guys starts, or is it just present in scholarship as far back as we can go?
I've had some fun with this. A lot of what we see is sort of a slippage from earlier theological readings to readings that are allegedly historical, but just paper over the sort of theological elements. So an example of this, one of the reasons I think that Assyria is that Isaiah 7 is read as anti-Assyrian is because within a theological reading, and especially actually within really both Jewish and Christian theology, and sort of after the fact, this becomes a story about a pagan versus a sort of theologically correct, chosen monotheistic group. That's not the case historically at the moment that this is being written, but in sort of retrospect, Assyria becomes this sort of religious enemy. And when you look back at some of the medieval rabbinic commentaries on Isaiah, you'll see this, that this is a question of religious praxis, orthopraxy or orthodoxy, what is correct and incorrect in terms of worship. Judah is chosen for worshiping their God. This is the correct worship form. That then goes, and that is pretty continuous until you have the decipherment of Akkadian and a better understanding of the broader political context. And what was originally read as sort of a theological question then gets reread as a question of the great statesman in the late 1800s. So Isaiah becomes not a prophet telling religious truth, but a brilliant great statesman. And this then continues to be reread and rehashed, sometimes in really paradoxical and kind of disturbing ways. So we get a lot of scholarship on Isaiah as resistance prophet, anti-colonial resistor, right? And so that type of reading, even though it's using terms from post-colonial scholarship, is often re-entrenching Orientalism by presenting Assyria as this sort of uniformly evil, despotic empire, and then presenting the Bible as this sort of wonderful, enlightened resistance text.
Given how many layers there are in our preconceived understandings of both the Hebrew Bible and the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and in the very long history, how difficult has it been to kind of look at it with fresh eyes and really start to reevaluate the relationship between Judah and the Neo-Assyrians?
It's an interesting question. I think, do you mean sort of like how do I put myself in that mindset, or?
Yeah, I guess, how do you put yourself in that mindset, and do you experience any kind of substantial pushback when you talk about this in academic spaces?
Yeah, I tend not to. So I would say the most difficult thing I think to imagine, or I guess I'll start with one of the reasons that I became interested in this problem is that I love Assyrian palace art. I just find it magnificent. I could stare all day at reliefs. And the more I look at them, the more I love them, and the more new things I find. So for me, I have this sort of, I find myself drawn to Assyrian art. And in that sense, it was very easy to start to question the assumption that everybody would have hated Assyria. Because I'm sitting there looking at it and I'm thinking, well, I don't hate this. Assuming that everybody is human like me, maybe some people in antiquity were also drawn to this. I'd say that within biblical studies, there is a fairly monolithic voice at this point that the Bible opposes Assyria. If you are interested in learning more about Assyria and your background is in biblical studies, moving over to reading an Assyriology is going to make a huge difference. I think Assyriologists are quite comfortable with the idea that people would have found Assyria appealing. Beata Pongratz-Leisten has a book, Religion and Ideology in Assyria, that is really interesting. And she sort of opens it by framing this as a common misconception that empires rule by coercion alone, when usually they rule by persuasion, by convincing people it's in their best interest, and by awing people. So I'd say that there's definitely work in that direction. Assyriology does tend to be more technical. We have not historically done a great job reaching out to the broader public, sort of speaking in terms that would draw people in. And so I think that it's less been a difficulty of audience or of imagination, and more just of register and of moving between two fields that have very different norms and very different assumptions.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions more about the current situation and studying history in the modern world. And then I have one question from our Patreon listeners, and then we'll be wrapping this up. I wanted to ask why you think it's relevant to study ancient history. Why is it important? Why should people care about ancient history?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is I keep coming back to the feeling of like awe and wonder I have when I look at Assyrian reliefs. And one of my goals with my book that's coming out is to help people feel that too. Because I think I can take for granted that almost all my readers have some sort of aversion to Assyria, have a sense of it as an unethical, evil empire. But I'd say that it's really, I think, important to learn to hold in our minds at the same time that we can find something beautiful, that something can have meaning to us, and that something can cause tremendous harm. That could be our position within a nation. It could be our position within a religious community. But it means that we need to be able to live in a space and find ways to address the ethically problematic, the damaging, the destructive tendencies that are sort of enmeshed with things that we really do value.
I have, as I said, one question from a Patreon member who says in 1968, Isaac Asimov, in Asimov's Guide to the Bible, suggested that the supposedly Assyrian general Holofernes, who was famously decapitated, was actually a Persian general, and that the Rite of Judith had telescoped the Egyptian campaign of Artaxerxes with that of Ashurbanipal and made Holofernes, the Persian general, the leader of the Assyrian hosts. I have no idea if you can answer this question, but he wants to know, has there been any progress since the 60s in pinning down just who the historical Holofernes was?
What do you actually know what the reference is for Holofernes? Is that
I do not. I am looking it up now.
Oh, it's in the Book of Judith. Okay. So this is in a text that is considered, it's part of certain Christian Bibles, not part of the sort of Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, or the Protestant canon. That's neither here nor there. And this is a text that's written much, much later than the Assyrian period. And I would think significantly later also than any Persian campaigns. This looks like this is going to be like a Hellenistic era text. So I would not put my money on the author of this book having reliable information about any characters at all in the story. I would read this purely as a sort of fictional account. And I mean fictional in the sense that perhaps even its author was really aiming to write a short story, aiming to write fiction. Not all of the texts that end up in the biblical canon were being written with the intent of producing something that people would consider part of a canon, right? So I would probably, I am not aware of whether there's been a breakthrough in an attempt to identify this with a specific historical figure, but I'd say even if the name itself could be identified with a figure, the chances that reliable details about that historical character are making it through into this book is very, very low.
Thank you very much for your answer. I'm sorry that was a bit of a blindside for you. Peter, thank you for submitting it. I'm sorry we don't have anything more satisfying and substantial for you. And we are going to wrap up there. Dr. DeGrado, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.
Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.